Well, good morning, everyone. I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and this year we are celebrating the cultural and geographic regions in the United States, and during week 8 of the lecture series, we will explore the region of the U.S. known as the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes region is known for its abundant fresh water, vibrant outdoor recreation, strong industrial history, and its enduring Native American cultures, whose history, traditions, and stewardship of the land and waters span thousands of years. And we're fortunate that Catherine Jellison joins us today for our first lecture in the series, which is generously supported by the Mary Lou and Dan Leffler, or Don, that is. Catherine earned her PhD at the University of Iowa, where she studied with one of the pioneers of U.S. women's history, Linda K. Kerber. Jellison has received numerous research grants and fellowships and is an Ohio University Presidential Research Scholar. In this morning's presentation, Iroquois Women, Life on Lake Ontario, explores the political and social power the Iroquois women held in their culture. As a reminder, later this evening, we'll have a historic portrayal of Abraham Lincoln here in Orchestra Hall at 7:30. And then also, if you would please mute your cell phone ringers if you haven't already, it would be appreciated. And please help me in welcoming Catherine Jellison.
Thank you, John. Is my mic okay? Can people hear me all right? Yeah. Good. Well, that was a lovely introduction, and I'm so happy to be back here. I was here last summer to give a couple of lectures, and I had such a pleasant time that I told John, invite me back anytime. So he did, and so I'm here today. In this topic, Iroquois Women, Life on Lake Ontario, I need to say that, of course, the Iroquois women didn't call themselves Iroquois. The name for the 5 original tribes that made up the Iroquois Confederacy was the Haudenosaunee. And this was the Iroquois word for people of the Longhouse. So this was a description of their living facilities. You have probably heard about the Iroquois Longhouse. So they lived in kinship groups in these long houses, and so their name for themselves reflected the way that they arranged their kinship groups and their living situation. The term Iroquois is the English pronunciation, so this is a term invented by English colonists. The English pronunciation of a word that the French colonists above Lake Ontario had come up with, and their pronunciation was Iroquois. So English colonists anglicized it to Iroquois. But Iroquois in French was a corruption of an Algonquin, a Huron term that meant snakes or black snakes, because the Hurons and Algonquins were enemies of the Iroquois. So this is not the name that these women would have used themselves. In fact, all Native nations used a variant of the people or the human beings, and then with a bit of description, perhaps, as in this case, the people of the Longhouse. As I said, Haudenosaunee would be the Iroquois word. But we, modern Americans, know these folks as the Iroquois. So that's the term I will be using. The Iroquois, like every other people we know of, I was going to say every other indigenous people, but all people, traditionally divide labor along gendered lines. So men are assigned certain tasks and women are assigned certain tasks. And in Native America, the primary division of labor was women were the farmers. They were responsible for the plant-based part of the diet. And men were in charge of procuring the protein part of the diet, either by hunting or fishing. And this is one of our earliest visual depictions of this division of labor in Native America. This was actually an engraving done by a Spanish artist who was part of the colonial experience in Florida in the 1500s and the 16th century. And so you see here the men are preparing the ground for agriculture. They're on the right. But the women are the people who are actually doing the planting. The woman who's farthest back is using a pole to make holes in the ground. The other two women are scattering seeds into the holes. And for Europeans, the first Europeans here in the Americas, the Spanish, this depiction here of agriculture in Florida in the 16th century definitely plays up differences in the male and female body, right? The men are heavily muscled. They have great upper body strength, and they're using these kind of hoe-type implements to prepare the ground for agriculture. And the women are bare-breasted. So again, this is the Spanish artist showing us the difference in the male and female body. And they have long flowing, I guess, when I was a kid, I would have called it frizzy hair, wavy hair. And of course, in terms of the physical, if we had had cameras in the day, if we had taken a picture of the physical appearance of these indigenous women, they wouldn't have had hair that was like that. They might have had long hair, longer hair than men, but it wouldn't have been wavy, it would have been straight. So I think the artist is again trying to say, hey, these are women. Europeans who will be looking at this engraving, don't get confused. Yes, they're doing something that in Europe is an activity assigned to men, being farmers. But I'm going to give them hair that looks a lot like European women's hair, so you don't mistake that these are anything other than women. And you can imagine that the early European colonists were scandalized by this. They're scandalized by a couple of elements of this particular image, the lack of clothing on both men and women here. But remember, this is Florida, and they're out working in the Florida environment. And the fact that women are the farmers, because Europeans would have said, everyone knows a man's the farmer, because that's how we do it in Europe. So this early depiction by a European artist of what Native American agriculture would have looked like certainly shows us the division of labor, but it's also making some value judgments, I think, on the situation. Now, those Native American nations that were particularly dependent on agriculture had the highest status for their women, because women were very honored as the primary food givers. And I'll show you this map here quickly. So if we look here, at Lake Ontario, and then of course right next door, Lake Erie, the portions of this map that have that checkerboard pattern are those portions of the map of North America where agriculture was the primary subsistence system, that the diet was provided primarily by cultivated plants, and women, of course, are the cultivators. So we see that there are broad portions of the North American map where this is the case, and probably it was down here in northern Mexico where we first see corn cultivated purposely. And then that kind of way of life based around primarily the growing of corn, beans, and squash spread to other parts of the map, including up here around, well, of course, our favorite Great Lake, Erie, but also the one to the east, Ontario. And someone usually asks me, why is this, because I'm from Athens, Ohio, as is Lynn Woods sitting up here at the front. So where Athens would be is largely blank on this map. This map, if you're going to place a year on it, would be 1492 approximately. It's because this was a lightly settled part of the map of Ohio at that time. and was primarily a hunting ground where many tribes came and went seasonally. But these other portions of the map, archaeologists and anthropologists say, we are pretty certain what the dominant sustenance activity was. So fishing here in coastal areas, out where I'm from originally, which is the Great Plains, hunting, game, bison, plant gathering, which women would have been primarily responsible for, and cultivated plants are checkerboard pattern. So it is in these portions of the North American map where we see women have the highest status in Native America, because they are very much honored as the primary food givers. So when we're talking about the Iroquois Confederacy, we're talking about originally 5 tribes here below Lake Ontario, from east to west: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the westernmost, the Seneca. And I'm going to give some particular attention later in this talk to the Seneca, the westernmost tribes. And so, as you see, this map represents the year 1650. So this would be by the time we have both English and French colonists here in the Lake Ontario area. Obviously, oops, wrong implement. There we go. There's the pointer. Below Lake Ontario, the Iroquois, and we are beginning to have English colonial presence here. And above Lake Ontario is Huron territory, which is also a confederacy of tribes, and they are enemies of the Iroquois here below Lake Ontario. And above Lake Ontario, we have, of course, the presence of French colonists. So these are the 5 original tribes and their location at the time, approximately 1650, that you had a significant white presence and you have lots of white men writing down what they see. And that is going to be key to some of my further comments today. What did white people think they were seeing when they observed Iroquois women? Now, in 1722, a 6th tribe comes north and joins the Iroquois Confederacy. And those were the Tuscaroras, who were located in present-day North Carolina and Virginia, and they had been displaced by English colonists. And so they are pushed out, they move north, and they are adopted by the Oneidas. And so by the time we get to the so-called French and Indian War, or what Europeans call the 7 Years' War, and certainly by the time that we're commemorating this summer, the American Revolution, it's no longer the 5 Iroquois tribes, it's the 6 tribes, because the Tuscaroras have joined the Confederacy, adopted or sponsored by the Oneida tribe. So what does it mean that the women who lived here below Lake Ontario had a great deal of power and influence in their society? And what did it mean that that derived from their role as agriculturalists? Well, I don't think we need to look any farther than the creation story of the Iroquois to understand women's central role in the life of the Iroquois. So creation stories can tell us many things. They certainly can provide insight into traditional religious beliefs. Think of the story of Genesis. And in Genesis, there's a good creator figure, right? But the first human figure that appears is a man, Adam. In the Iroquois creation story, which is called The Story of Sky Woman, the title right there tells you something, that the first human creature is a woman called Sky Woman. We also can see in creation stories evidence of the subsistence systems that were used by, in this case, indigenous people, and something about the kinship systems. There were a variety of kinship systems in Native America, but the 2 primary ones were matrilocal and patrilocal, matrilineal and patrilineal. Matrilocal means that after a young couple married, they went to live near or with the bride's family. Patrilocal is the opposite. After marriage, they go to live with the groom's family. And matrilineal means that membership in a clan is traced through the woman's line. So when a young couple would marry, that means that the family, their offspring, will be traced through the mother's lineage. And patrilineal is the opposite of that. And the fact that most of us, when we're born, take on our father's last name here in modern America is a vestige of a patrilineal system that used to exist in Europe. But by the time European colonists are coming here to North America, that has died away, and we trace through both our mother's and father's line a system called bilateralism. See, you thought I was a historian? I'm getting a little anthropological with you today. So we retain that ancient European custom of taking our father's last name, but we know we belong to both sides of the family. We have bilateral descent. Well, those areas of the map, those checkerboard areas that I showed you a few minutes ago, where agriculture is the dominant means of subsistence, those societies tended to be matrilocal and matrilineal. So most of those checkerboard areas, if I were to show you maps for living location after marriage and systems of descent, those maps would correspond with the highly agricultural areas. So that is an indication of the kind of power and influence women had in those checkerboard areas of the map, the agricultural portions of the map. Well, what does the Sky Woman story tell us about these various issues? Religion, subsistence, where one lives after marriage, how one traces one's ancestry. Well, I'll quickly tell you the story of Sky Woman, and then I have a few fun slides in reference to it. In the Iroquois creation story, a mysterious woman falls from the sky, hence her name, Sky Woman, and she falls into the water, and we can assume that the water was Lake Ontario. And Great Turtle comes and rescues her and picks her up and puts her on his back. And you see, there she is. She's about in the middle of the top of his shell. She's walking around there. And then other lake creatures, beavers, muskrats, toads, start gathering up soil from the bottom of the lake and come to the surface and start giving it to Great Turtle. And he and the woman start building the earth on his back. So the belief is that the world is carried on the back of a turtle. And of course, this story is passed down orally because there was no written language for the Iroquois or any of the traditional indigenous languages here in North America. But beginning in the 19th century and the 20th century, there have been written versions of the story, but it survived all of those centuries told from generation to generation orally. Well, somehow, after she's built the world on top of the turtle, and I'll tell you, this has, it has an origin story in the natural world. Seeing Earth on top of a turtle's back. Here you go. These are some of what I called my fun slides. These are a couple of turtles in the spring after they've come out of hibernation. And so you see they do have Earth on their backs. So this would have been something that the people creating this creation story would have seen in real life, the Earth on a turtle's back in the spring. Now, here's one I just couldn't resist. It's my dog discovering a turtle before it's gone into hibernation. And oh, I'm so glad John gave me this pointer. So this, you can tell, is in the fall. And this poor turtle, this is at the bottom of our pond, is back up here. This is the dam by the pond. And this turtle had started digging this hole to go hibernate, and my dog found it and played with it a little while. Luckily didn't get injured by the turtle. And then the turtle crawled back in there to begin hibernating. But I couldn't resist a dog picture. Other indigenous creation stories do feature dogs, mainly out in my native area of the map, the Great Plains. Various Great Plains tribes have stories where a dog, as opposed to a turtle, is the central animal figure, because before the Spanish introduced the modern horse to North America, the main animal of burden was a dog, would carry things from place to place for indigenous people out on the Great Plains. So I guess that's my excuse for bringing my dog into this lecture, is there were some indigenous creation stories that did feature dogs. Anyway, once Sky Woman has fallen onto the turtle and has started creating the earth on top of the turtle's shell, somehow she gets pregnant, and this is never really explained because she's the only human. Maybe the Iroquois also believe in the Immaculate Conception, I'm not sure. But unlike the Holy Mother, this mother, Sky Woman, is carrying twins. And this tells us something about the cosmology, the religious beliefs of the Iroquois. You've already noticed a lot of cooperation between people in the natural world. And there was a belief that every animal species had its own spirit, and they were spiritual beings just like people. And in fact, many of the written versions of the Sky Woman story, well, I'll read the beginning here of this particular written version. In the beginning, there was nothing but water, nothing but a wide, wide sea. And listen to this language. The only people in the world were the animals that live in and on water. So there was, as we see in this creation story, the idea that there's cooperation between the human and the animal world, and they all have a soul, a spirit, are equals with human beings at some level. Not as in, for instance, the Genesis story, where we see Adam naming all the species. He is seen as above the animals and like the head mammal who gets to name the other species. When she's pregnant with the twins, we get some insight into another religious belief of the Iroquois, which was that there's good and evil. And that should be familiar to us also from the Genesis story, which is the creation story probably the people in this room know the best. So there's a good twin and a bad twin that Sky Woman, is gestating. And the good twin is going to be born through the birth canal. The bad twin doesn't want to be born the natural way. And the bad twin breaks through her side and kills her. But from her body grow the three sisters, the three staple crops of Native American agriculture: the corn, beans, and squash. So from her broken body, here come the three central crops of Native American agriculture. And they are called by a feminine noun, sisters, the three sisters, and are seen as very important because they are what sustains life among the Iroquois. Sometimes, and this is a 21st century representation of the three sisters. So we see the squash down here. Oftentimes it's in the creation, some versions of the creation story specifically say pumpkins, but squash of some type. You can see the beans growing around the stalks of the corn, and then the corn itself. And then the three spiritual elements that guard these crops, because not only was there the belief that every animal species had its own spirit, but every plant species, every living species had a spiritual component. So, the three sisters. And the good twin goes on and carries out the remainder of Iroquois life, becomes the figure that is responsible for all the Iroquois people who are yet to be born, and would have been designated not as a father's kin, we don't even have a father in the story, but as his mother's descendant. So again, that tells us something about family life organization here and the tracing of ancestry among the Iroquois. The bad twin goes on to make trouble in the world. So, what does it mean exactly that women among the Iroquois have a lot of power as agriculturalists? Reflected in the creation story, reflected in calling the three main crops the three sisters. Well, not only is our living situations and family organizations, means of organizing the family kinship groups, revolving around women, but women, although they don't sit in the official Iroquois councils that make policy, they are advisors to the men who hold those positions. Older women in particular, and this is a society that honors age, older women have a great deal of influence within the governing councils among the Iroquois tribes. Older women had the right to nominate council members. They could depose chiefs that they didn't like. They were the ones who functioned as advisors on village affairs. And although they don't hold the formal public positions of power, they play these important advisory roles, primarily because Iroquois people can't do anything unless they're provided food, which means including going to war with the Huron or the Algonquin or whomever. So these older women have the right to say, well, we will give you the food supplies to go to battle. You know, this is a great deal of power that especially older Iroquois women have. Younger Iroquois women, and this is something that those early European men who are writing down accounts of what they see or what they think they see, this is something else they were quite scandalized by. Now remember, although in fictional versions of colonial life, early colonial life, you know, the 17th century, think of that map with the 5 tribes, think of 1650-ish. Maybe especially here on the 250th birthday of the US, we romanticize things. Oh, this was a place where anyone could come from Europe and, you know, make their way, and everyone becomes rich. Well, of course, the movers and shakers in European colonial society were well-to-do men. They're the ones with the literacy skills. They're the ones who are financing these colonial experiments, which in the 1600s, you know, this was still an experiment. Will Europeans and their descendants remain here permanently? The military officers were well-to-do men, and certainly the clergy, priests, north of Lake Ontario with the Huron, Protestant pastors, below Lake Ontario, especially Anglican pastors, here among the English. And so these are educated men who have writing skills, and they are at the top of the hierarchy back in Europe. And they're here in what becomes the US, and they're taking down what they see in written form, sending many of their accounts back to Europe. But one thing that whether it's a Catholic priest or an English military man one thing that they disapprove of is that women among the people here at Lake Ontario are choosing their own marriage partners. So if you think of these upper-class men, this would be unheard of back in their society. Young women weren't allowed to, like their sisters, their own wives, had not made that choice. Upper-class people, their families made these decisions for them. So one thing that they saw here among the Iroquois women was that women seemed to choose their own mates. And they also practiced serial monogamy, meaning they would be married to one man at a time, but if he, for some reason, displeased the young woman, she would say, the marriage is off. And there were a variety of reasons why a woman here among the Iroquois would say, I'm out of here. And some of them sound like very modern grounds for divorce. Of course, we now live in the era of no-fault divorce, but if some of you remember back to the mid-20th century, you had to have, especially here in New York State, until 1966, can you believe it, the only grounds for divorce was adultery. So adultery is one of the grounds for divorce here among the Iroquois, but laziness, that would end a lot of marriages, I would think, in the modern world. Sterility, not being able to reproduce. Cruelty or bad temper, that was a grounds for divorce that some of us are familiar with. And it was very simple. I mean, if a man displeased a woman because of any of these reasons I've just given you, she just took his belongings out of the longhouse and set them outside. And she was free to find another man, he was free to find another woman, but in every case, the children stayed with her because of matrilineality. So again, above Lake Ontario, divorce, the French colonists, oh, there's no such thing, right? Marriage is for life. If you're married within the Catholic Church, you have to stay married. Even the Protestants below Lake Ontario, divorce is so rare. And in England at this time, divorce could only happen by an act of Parliament. So only wealthy people had access to divorce, and it was very rare. You had to have good connections with the MPs, and they would pass a law, yes, this couple is divorced. So divorce was so rare in Europe at this time, and to see it by their perspective being accomplished so casually here, that bothered the early colonists who are leaving us their written accounts. And in the rare case, when divorce did happen in Europe, men always kept the children. So this frequent divorce and the women always keeping the children seemed odd to these folks. Another observation that was made by these early colonists about Iroquois women, younger Iroquois women, was that they didn't give birth in community like European women did, where a woman would go to the childbirth bed and her sisters, her mother, her good friends would gather around and assist her. Instead, women gave birth alone, or maybe sometimes with their mother or some other older woman at her side. But they introduced their children after childbirth immediately to the natural world, would take the newborn baby. A common place to give birth would be near a stream, wash the baby in the cold stream. In the winter, wipe it off with snow so that the child is acclimated to the natural world very quickly. And the women gave birth in a squatting position. Unlike, again, upper-class European women that these men writing these accounts would be familiar with, who are giving birth, lying flat on their backs. And again, so much of this sounds very contemporary, doesn't it? Because today, this is something that women are often encouraged to do, is get in the position that's comfortable to give birth to the baby, and that might be a squatting position. Now, I assume there are several people here in this audience who have given birth, and you know it can't happen without some pain, but these early male observers of Iroquois women said, oh, these women, childbirth is nothing to them. They get up and do their chores as soon as it's over. Yeah. Well, what they are doing here in these kinds of descriptions is noticing that it isn't seen as some kind of medical drama to these women, as it is in Europe among the upper class at this time. But they're also not quite giving these women full credit as human beings, right? Oh, they're just like animals. They give birth and then they're up about their business. So some problems with some of their descriptions of childbirth. In terms of the number of children that Iroquois women gave birth to, they gave birth to fewer children than European women at the time. And again, looking at the upper class background of the men who give us these first written accounts, they are from well-to-do families, maybe even titled families, and it's important to give birth to a lot of children to carry on the dynasty, etc. And the practice among upper-class women at this time in Western Europe was that they didn't breastfeed their own babies. They gave them to peasant women who would nurse the babies. So wet nurses. And many of these early European male observers of Iroquois women said, oh, we like it that these women breastfeed their own babies. That's good. They kind of maybe had always questioned this wet nurse phenomenon in Western Europe at the time. But what they're not recognizing, because no one does for a few more centuries, that prolonged lactation can disrupt the female reproductive cycle. And that a woman can't conceive another baby as quickly if she's breastfeeding a previous baby for a couple of years. And so Iroquois women often did that, breastfed till the children were toddlers. And so that was sort of built-in birth control that caused them to have fewer children. And this was seen as odd, but the men aren't making the connection that the prolonged breastfeeding probably has something to do with this. But they think these women are, maybe they had problems with sterility during certain periods because of their unhealthy way of life or something. But it really was probably the prolonged breastfeeding, and sometimes there was also the understanding that while the woman is still breastfeeding, she won't have sexual relations with her husband. So that was like built in. That's double birth control. In terms of raising their children, these early European male observers thought that indigenous parents, and again, specifically here among the Iroquois, who are so widely observed and written about, that these women are terrible parents because they don't discipline their children enough. They let the kids, run around and make noise and toilet train themselves. They aren't forced to toilet train at a certain age. When they're ready, they're ready. That they don't socialize their children into girl or boy roles until about ages 8 or 9. And that if children are sexually curious, that's just seen as natural. If they're experimenting a little bit while they're still under their mother's care, that she's not going to make a big fuss about it. So all of these things, these early European male observers thought were wrong. They also thought that these women, as I noted before, are immoral because they don't dress like European women, although I'm going to show you some authentic clothing of the Iroquois, and you'll see they certainly wore more than if they were agriculturalists in Florida. And during some parts of the year, they were pretty well covered up. But that they still wore less clothing than upper class. Again, I can't stress this enough, that these men are making comparison to women in their own families back in Europe. You know, upper class women with all the petticoats and the high collars and all of that. And these women certainly don't dress this way. So most of our accounts are, as I've noted, from male Europeans. And they really think that everything is backwards here, with a few exceptions. And they oftentimes even characterize these Iroquois women as the men's slaves, because the women are doing all this agricultural work, and they think the men are forcing them to do that. And when they see the men in the villages, they're relaxing, taking naps. They don't follow the men out on the hunt. They don't follow the men outside the villages to the deer hunt or the moose hunt. They don't follow them into battle. They don't see how the men's life away from the agricultural villages could be very strenuous and dangerous, and when they're back in the village, they need time to relax and recuperate. So these male observers who are just staying in the villages don't see the men in their assigned duties, just see them, you know, according to the European men, just lying about being lazy and making women do all the work here in the village, the agricultural work. So what we really need, and luckily we have it, is an insider's view. If these outsider men say, this is what's going on here with the Iroquois women, and they're drudges, they're slaves, and when the opposite, as I hopefully have just convinced you all, is that these women have a lot of power and say-so in their society, certainly more than women in Europe at this time. So the men are getting it wrong. Why don't we get a women's perspective of what it was like to be an Iroquois woman? And that brings us to this figure, Mary Jemison. Mary Jemison was born on the ship that brought her parents from the British Isles. They settled as a farm family in colonial Pennsylvania. And during, again, what Americans call the French and Indian War, the war between the British colonists and the French colonists and their Indian allies, in that war, she is kidnapped. Her whole family is kidnapped. Some of them are killed straight out. But we're not quite sure if this is her birth year, but it's around 1743, when she is taken captive in this raid on her community there in Pennsylvania. She was maybe 14, 15 years old, so she's a teenager. And she is not killed, but she is taken by that westernmost of the Iroquois tribes, the Seneca, and she is adopted. And as you see, she lives a long life. She lives to about 90. So from the time of 15 until she perishes at the age of 90, she lives her life as an Iroquois woman. And she had several opportunities to leave that way of life. She could have left when there were prisoner exchanges at the end of the French and Indian War. She could have left again at the end of the Revolutionary War. Iroquois country was some of the most heavily damaged area of the nation in the battles of the Revolutionary War. And most of the Iroquois sided with the British, by the way. And so the American military took a scorched earth policy. We will destroy all of the crops of the Iroquois. We will destroy their housing structures. We will destroy the food that they have stored. And it is an estimate that between a fourth and a third of the Iroquois population died in the American Revolution, either through starvation or in battle. But when the war ends and the American side has won, she has a chance to leave then too, because now that the British are gone, there was an opportunity for American-born people to be sought out and brought back from their lives with indigenous people. There was quite a movement to do that, even people who had been living as an indigenous person for as long as Mary Jemison had been. So she had opportunities to leave, but she never did. And a few years before she died, in 1824, she tells her story to a white man named James Seaver, who was a minister there in New York State, and he wrote down her story. So we have her oral testimony of what her life was like. He writes it down, and the book has been in continuous print since 1824. And this is the edition that I have always assigned my students. It's published by the University of Oklahoma Press, and the editor is June Namias. And the title has never changed, A Narrative of the Life of Mrs. Mary Jemison. And the cover art is by an indigenous woman, and she has attempted here to show what being an agriculturalist would have been like for Iroquois women. So they wear this long shirt, and then kind of a skirt below it, and then pants, and then moccasins. And they are out here working in the cornfields together. Women's agricultural work was communal. They're out there working together. But this is a good representation of how they would have dressed. Certainly by the time that Mary Jemison is adopted by the Seneca, because they had started having access to European cloth, manufactured cloth. So, because this is already, by the time she's taken captive and adopted, it's the late 1750s. And so they might have been dressed in this colorful manner even as they're out there farming. I have one small criticism of this cover art, which is I think that the handles of their hoes were probably shorter than that. But perhaps the idea was to get across that these are hoes to the people who are looking at the artwork. So what does Mary Jemison have to say about life with the Iroquois, as she tells James Seaver? Well, first of all, she says that after a while, she didn't want to get away anymore because she had been adopted, as you see here on this historical marker, if you can read it. 2 Seneca sisters adopted her to replace their teenaged brother who'd been killed in the French and Indian War. The early male European observers had said, another thing these folks get backwards is they seem to rejoice more in the birth of a girl than a boy. That's wrong. Well, of course, it's not by the Iroquois value system. Oh, good, a new little agriculturalist is here, yay. So these sisters who adopt Mary Jemison, and it was the women who made the decision, do captives get killed or do they get adopted? These 2 sisters probably think they've made a good deal. We lost a little hunter-warrior, but we're gaining a little agriculturalist. And she grew to love her adoptive sisters. And very soon is married to an indigenous man, and by her late teens is already a mother. Now this is interesting. She's always known by her birth name, although English-speaking people recognizing that she'd been a married woman. In fact, she had 2 different indigenous husbands. The first died, and then she had a second one, and that was the father of most of her children. They gave her the honorific Mrs., but she keeps the name she was born with, Mary Jemison, appropriate for matrilineality, and all of her children were called Jemison. But she gave them the first names of her white family members who had been killed in the attack. So her first baby is named Thomas, after one of her deceased family members. So she has mixed race children. You know, I can't just leave them. They won't be accepted back in white society. My sisters have been very kind to me. They rescued me, they saved me, they adopted me. But then she goes on to talk about this agricultural labor. Our labor was not severe, and that of one year was exactly similar in almost every respect to that of the others, without that endless variety that it is to be observed in the common labor of the white people. Notwithstanding, the Indian women have all the fuel and bread to procure and the cooking to perform, their task is probably not harder than that of white women who have those articles provided for them, and their cares certainly are not half as numerous nor as great. In the summer season, we planted, tended, and harvested our corn, and generally had all our children with us, but had no master to oversee or drive us so that we could work as leisurely as we pleased. So no one was there bossing them around. Their friends were with them, and the children were oftentimes with them when they're out working in the field. So the tasks were very easy. They were similar. There wasn't this great diversity that maybe a colonial housewife had in her activities. So that's one thing. She says, I kind of appreciated this. Because remember, she is taken in and adopted by the Seneca at about 15, and she would have already seen her mother and had been taught to do the kind of work her mother was doing. So she knows the great variety that a farm wife in Pennsylvania, white farm wife, the variety of her labor. But also, she appreciated that the Iroquois just didn't have as much stuff to keep track of. She says, as our cooking and eating utensils consisted of a hominy block and pestle, a small kettle, a knife or two, and a few vessels of bark or wood, it required but little time to keep them in order for use. And then what about all of those clothes that white women wear? And they have to make those clothes. Spinning, weaving, sewing, stocking, knitting, and the like are arts which have never been practiced in the Indian tribes generally. After the Revolutionary War, I learned to sew so that I could make my own clothing after a poor fashion. But the other domestic arts I have been wholly ignorant of application of since my captivity. Our clothing, the Iroquois clothing, was fastened together with strings of deer skin and tied on with the same. So, I didn't have to spin the wool thread or the linen thread from the flax, and then I didn't have to weave, and I didn't have to sew, and we didn't wear socks that always had to be darned. She's basically saying, when I look at it, yes, there were these reasons of having mixed race children I was concerned about. I felt I owed something to the sisters who saved me and adopted me. I was young enough that I could learn all these new ways of living at 15, and I just became used to them pretty quickly. But I just found that life was also easier. Clothing construction's easier, our daily labor was easier, and we did it communally. I wasn't isolated in a cabin like maybe my birth mother had been. And then she ends with a little bit of, this is appropriate for Chautauqua, a little bit of a temperance sermon here. In that manner we lived without any of those jealousies, quarrels, and revengeful battles between families and individuals, which have been common in the Indian tribes since the introduction of ardent spirits amongst them. She is speaking out of personal tragedy. A couple of her sons were what today we would recognize as alcoholics and died violently in alcoholic circumstances. So let me tell you a little bit more about Mary Jemison, and we are so fortunate to have this first-person account where she says, regardless of what those early European men thought they were seeing, I thought this was an okay way to live, and I appreciated it. You might be familiar with a couple of 20th century depictions of Mary Jemison. I don't know if anyone's ever visited Letchworth State Park in New York, yeah. And this famous statue of her is there. It was put up in 1910, and the sculptor is Henry Bush Brown, hyphenated Henry Bush Brown. And it has under here on the pedestal her Iroquois name, Degowanis, which meant two falling voices. The two sisters who adopted her were in mourning for their brother, and that was their mourning chant, two falling voices. So there, no doubt that she was meant as a replacement for their young brother, but she's going to be working alongside them. She's going to be an agriculturalist. And Bush Brown, in creating this statue that's in Letchworth State Park, hired as his model a young Scots-Irish woman, because that was the ethnic heritage of Mary Jemison. And so she was the model for the face. And then he borrowed items from the New York Natural History Museum and has accurately reproduced the kind of clothing that she would be wearing. So again, the long shirt, underneath that a skirt, the pants, and then her moccasins. And if the woman who, take off my glasses, who raised her hand that she's been there, maybe you've seen the statue and been to the back side. Oh, there are a couple of women. Okay, so you know she's carrying Thomas, her first child, on her back there. And so this is a pretty accurate, as accurate as we're ever going to get, visual image of what Mary Jemison looked like as a young mother. Perhaps more familiar to people here at Lakeside, my students probably, well, no, I think some young people do still read this book, but it was very popular in the 20th century. Lois Lenski was a famous children's book author and illustrator. And so in 1941, she published this children's book, Indian Captive, the story of Mary Jemison. And as you see here, she's really playing up the whiteness and the youth. Here's a prepubescent, right? Younger than the real Mary Jemison would have been, and very blonde. And she told Seaver, when she was telling her story, that she'd had chestnut-colored hair. So she's playing up Lenski, the whiteness and the youth. So this is hotter weather than our statue Mary Jemison is experiencing. So our Mary Jemison here on the Lois Lenski cover is topless, but that shows that she hasn't developed her breasts. Her breasts haven't developed yet, so she's portrayed more as like a 9 to 12-year-old than a 15-year-old. But here she is with the corn, the beans, and the squash, and the kind of woven basket that she is putting the crops into with the woven band around her head. That would be accurate. Here in the statue of Mary Jemison, she's wearing the band lower. It's here on the top of her chest because it's holding the cradle board that Thomas is in. But I think we still have to, even with her fame in the 20th century, and maybe particularly through this Lois Lenski book, we, I think, need to go back to that original source, the story she told to Seaver, because that gives us our best firsthand account by someone who, by the time she's telling her story, and for the many previous decades, had been an Iroquois woman. Now, I'll show you another early illustration. This is from the 1600s, the late 1600s, of Iroquois women pounding the corn and then cooking it to make, sort of corn pancakes. And we see them out here doing this. They're not doing the work of planting and harvesting in this case, but they are doing the processing of the agricultural products. And we see that a baby is there in the cradle board. So when Mary Jemison says, all my friends were with me, and we had our children with us, this would be a good This is an English artist's engraving of women out processing, in this case, the corn. One more 20th century image, and then I'll open things up for questions. This is a cartoon from the early 20th century. And you see the caption down there, savagery to civilization. And we see women, Iroquois women in traditional dress, standing on a cliff. And one woman has her baby there in the cradle board, and they're looking down on these early 20th century suffragists from the state of New York. Okay, so the original inhabitants of New York State, the suffragists of New York State, and I recognize, several of the faces there of the women who are the suffragists who are being portrayed. So the women, the suffragists, white suffragists are coming along with their flag, women's suffrage, and the Iroquois women are looking down over this cliff. And the Indian women say, "We whom you pity as drudges reached centuries ago the goal that you are now nearing." So when those early male observers said, "Oh, these women are practically slaves, drudges," they're saying, no, we had rights that you white women are just now acquiring or on the verge of acquiring. So the women go on to say, "We, the women of the Iroquois." Now, it says here, "own the land, the lodge, the children." There was no concept of private property ownership among pre-European contact indigenous people. But, they are in control of these elements. They farm the land. They live in the lodge or the longhouse of their woman-centered kinship group. The children are their descendants. Ours is the right of adoption, like Mary Jemison's sisters, of life or death, deciding who among captives will be executed, who will be adopted. Ours the right to raise up and depose chiefs. As I said, older women had this power within the councils. Ours the right of representation at all councils. Yes, those women are there. Ours the right to make and abrogate treaties. This is that war, giving the yes or no to, do we go to war, do we end the war, will we supply the food? Ours the supervision over domestic and foreign policies. Again, this is, war making. Ours, the trusteeship of the tribal property, again, the farmland and the longhouses. Our lives are valued again as high as man's. The idea that the early European men noted that they've got this thing backwards. They rejoice more when girls are born than when boys are born. But again, if it is a society that is so dependent in such a variety of ways, but particularly for the basic diet, if women are the ones in charge of that, they have high status. And so Iroquois women and other agriculturally based indigenous women certainly had more power and status than women in Europe did at the time, and even more power and status than women in some other indigenous tribes, particularly once the Spanish have introduced the horse and the Plains tribes get a hold of breakaway horses from the Spanish, and you have the mounted hunting and warrior culture of the Great Plains, and the men become much more efficient bison hunters as mounted hunters, not doing it on foot anymore. We see men's status rise, women's status out on the Great Plains fall. That's just one example. But so much of this idea of status in Native America is tied to who are the primary food givers, providers. So anyway, I'll close with this cartoon, and I'll open the floor to any questions people may have or comments. Yes?
The colonists were amazed at the cooperation of the Iroquois settlers, and that led to colonies uniting, overthrowing, England.
Yeah, and this is something that we're reminded of here at the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation. I have seen several accounts in the indigenous media, in newspaper accounts up in the area of upstate New York that have pointed that out, that this idea of unifying people of different, in this case, tribes, never going to war with one another, speaking a common language, allowing marriage across tribal lines, that kind of thing, that idea of confederation was indeed a model for what becomes the United States. Yes?
To obtain fur for trading with the Europeans in the late 17th and early 18th century, the Iroquois, I understand, had to go further and further west to get game. Do you know whether that affected the role of the women in any way?
That is true. You can see maybe why tribes that didn't like them called them snakes in their native languages, because they really were, the superpower of that portion, of that Great Lakes portion of the map, and were resented as they crept further west and displaced other peoples. I'll say this about the fur trapping, and this is alluded to in Jemison's comments about dependence on alcohol, that once European trade goods, including alcohol, are introduced, dependence on those items grows. And the need, if the tribe up the river has metal blades on their knives and you're still using, bone or stone, it's kind of a indigenous arms race. Well, I need to get some of those manufactured European blades too. So I need to trap more beaver to get those beaver skins to trade for more of those European goods with Europeans. And that is a very good point. I think as men's work as hunters and trappers to get the skins that will be used in the trade for European items, men's role as hunters does become more important and shifts a little bit the gender balance. But by that time, we see traditional indigenous life being changed in so many other ways with white contact. Disease, of course, contact with white people, measles, smallpox, diseases that were European diseases that indigenous people here had not had contact with and had no natural immunity. So we already have diminished numbers even before these periods of widespread warfare in the 18th century. We see, as I said, once trading starts with Europeans, we sometimes see overhunting, where whole populations of an animal will go extinct in an area because the men are trapping so many, let's say muskrats, beaver, whatever, that the population is killed off. And that could be to get certain tools, but particularly if there's alcohol addiction. And Europeans think alcohol is just the best item of trade because it's something that's pretty easily transported at the trading posts. Indians can just stay there and consume it on site and don't have to worry about transporting it back to the agricultural village. I think alcohol dependence, Mary Jemison was right, that made a huge negative difference in the life of the Iroquois people, because some of this overhunting, which will affect the way of life of indigenous people, is the result of we need to get more first to get more alcohol because we become physically and psychologically dependent on it. And as I've often told students, a couple of things that we didn't understand until 100 years ago, until the 1920s. We didn't understand that alcoholism was a disease until then, and we didn't understand the female reproductive system in the same way we understand it now until the 1920s. That's pretty recent. So when we talk about what's going on here in this exchange between Europeans and Native Americans, I mean, we could say, oh, you know, there were all these consequences, but many of them were unforeseen because there wasn't not that I'm excusing much of the behavior of these colonial projects, but in many instances, they really did not understand the consequences, and that those consequences would impact them negatively too. You're not going to get more beaver skins to make those fancy waterproof hats back in Europe if the population is all hunted out. Yes?
This is only somewhat related to the role of women with the Haudenosaunee, but your 1650 map shows the Seneca are east of the Genesee River. I thought today's reservations for the Seneca were along Lake Erie near Dunkirk and down near Salamanca and maybe some others.
Yes.
Can you talk
They are
about why
now.
that happened?
Yes, let me take a sip here and I will. Sure. Yeah, and yeah, along the Genesee River, obviously, if you read the historical marker, is where Mary Jemison ended up living. I'll tell a little background story. Because the vast majority of the Iroquois tribes sided with the British in the American Revolution, the first treaties the new U.S. government made with any people were treaties with the Iroquois. Now, many had escaped into Canada, and so were no longer in U.S. territory. But those that remained here were then placed on those reservations you're talking about at the end of the Revolutionary War. And I don't know, I mean, part of it is that the Seneca had, and the other tribes, you know, didn't stay static, as an earlier questioner had mentioned. You know, this is their 1650 locations. But these are, you know, very, by the standards of Western Indian reservations, you know, west of the Mississippi, present-day reservations, pretty small reservations. So those were created by some of the first treaties that the new U.S. government negotiated, in this case with indigenous nations, because at this point in our history, this is how we negotiate with Native Americans, just as if they were foreign nations. And remember, Native Americans don't get U.S. citizenship until 1924. So the only time I have met descendants of Mary Jemison, I took a tour of Mary Jemison sites up here in New York State, and it was a father and son who were Canadians, because so many of her descendants at the end of the war fled to Canada. They didn't want to be punished by the new U.S. government. And some of them spell their name Jameson as opposed to Jemison. But you notice they all follow matrilineality. They all still keep her last name. But yeah, those locations of the present day reservations were a product of the Iroquois being the losers in the war with the new United States. In fact, this is another tragedy of the Iroquois, is they again, my answer to an earlier question, they had always presented a united front. But in the American Revolution, the Oneidas and their adopted tribe, the Tuscaroras, side with the US, and the others side with the British. And there was a great deal of anger, as you can imagine, among the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras when they didn't get a better deal at the end of the war because they had backed the American side, and they too were relegated to these small reservations. Yes?
Yeah, Sullivan's March,
Yeah.
that was war on terror.
Yes.
Punishment, go up there.
Oh, yeah,
Just
yeah.
whack those guys.
Yeah, and she writes, she tells to Seaver in her narrative, she talks about General Sullivan, and she talks about the women and children had to flee, and they burned all of our, it was total war. War against civilians, right? Not just the young male warrior class. And it prefigured, Sherman's march to the sea in the Civil War. We'll just destroy everything in our path. And she finds refuge actually on the Genesee River, back to that question, with two escaped enslaved people who had escaped during the American Revolution and had taken over a little farm they found. And we don't know what the gender of these two people were. She calls one the old Negro man. We don't know who the other, was it his wife, was it his child, was it someone not related to him? But that's a really interesting part of her narrative, in that when she escapes Sullivan's army, she takes her children and goes to this, she's just trying to get away, and finds this little farmstead where these two escaped enslaved people have taken up farming, an abandoned farmstead. And she says that the old man she is the appropriate person to grow the crops there, she decides. So she's out there planting corn and raising crops on this little farm. And she said that the person she calls the old Negro man would guard her, would stand out there with a gun to make sure that, I assume, deserters from Sullivan's army or something don't find her there and injure her. Yeah. No, that's her account of, because we look at the American Revolution from the perspective of the U.S. military and U.S. government, we don't oftentimes see it from the perspective of people who were victims, as she was. So.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for being a great audience. Great questions.